Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who are joining us today. I'm really happy to welcome you to this event on a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 that delivers on both human rights and on sustainable development. My name is Birgitte Fejring. I am the Department Director at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and I will be your host today. First, let me share a few household remarks with you. We have translation from English into Spanish and French. You will find the instructions on how to access translation in the chat. I should also warn you that we have a very ambitious agenda with 3 panels on sustainable recovery, on civil society participation, and on investments in the context of pandemic response and recovery. We have an amazing lineup of very prominent speakers. So I can already see now that timekeeping will be an issue. So I will kindly upfront ask everybody to be brief so we can share this space and hear from everybody. So if you later see me desperately waving my real hand or sending virtual hearts your way, you will know that your time is up. But let us now move to the substantial discussion that we all look forward to. First, it is my pleasure to give the floor to United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Mrs. Ilse Brandts-Kjæris. Mrs. Brandts-Kjæris, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Birgitte, and excellencies, colleagues and friends. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level political forum side event. The focus of our discussion here is a critical one: how we can work together to ensure a truly sustainable recovery from COVID-19, a recovery that will help deliver on the 2030 agenda by placing states' human rights obligations front and center. In this regard, I'm particularly pleased that we are bringing together so many partners today, representing such varied constituents: member states, civil society representatives, national human rights institutions, and the Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, among others. We're particularly grateful for the support of the Permanent Mission of Denmark and Costa Rica. My sincere thanks go to all 10 partner organizations that contributed to this event, but to the Danish Institute for Human Rights in particular for leading this organization so ably. Distinguished guests and colleagues, as the world continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, its impact and human rights scars on our societies run very deep. The pandemic is reversing progress achieved in many countries and regions. For the first time in more than 20 years, global extreme poverty is on the increase. Last year alone, over 100 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. With the number of people going hungry and suffering from food insecurity has been gradually rising since 2014, the pandemic intensified this trend and is estimated to have pushed more than 80 million people into chronic hunger, moving the goalpost of eradicating hunger further away from us. In the words of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, like a tsunami that follows an earthquake, the socioeconomic crisis that follows the pandemic has long and far-reaching consequences. It has exacerbated every kind of inequality. However, there are also hopeful aspects of the crisis that we can and should learn from. The pandemic has mobilized heartening community resilience, decisive government action, and significant expansion of social protection as a temporary response measure. We have also seen efforts to place human rights at the center of COVID-19 recovery to build back better towards equal and just societies that will truly leave no one behind. Because we should never forget that inequality is a policy choice. We can take action to dismantle it. This requires political leadership, courage, and will. It means dismantling the laws, policies, and systems resulting in entrenching rather than eradicating inequalities. It means leadership that will move away from models of development that have generated inequalities towards a new social contract and a human rights economy. that will promote equal rights for all, in particular for the most marginalized communities. Starting with equal access to vaccines and increased investment in social spending, we must counter the two-speed economic recovery that is taking shape and work towards meaningful change. To do this, we need to ensure that all policymaking is grounded in meaningful participation, social dialogue, transparency, and accountability. This requires expanding and safeguarding civic space, a core element of SDG 16, which is essential to guaranteeing fundamental freedoms and unlocking the 2030 Agenda. The recently launched Sustainable Recovery Pledge seeks to prioritize such an approach by placing human rights at the heart of building a better future. Acknowledging that there is strength in numbers, I wish to conclude by welcoming the pledge joined by 47 countries to date. The pledge also speaks to the transformative vision of the Secretary General's call to action on human rights, which underscores the imperative to place human rights at the core of sustainable development and to protect civic space. It also emphasizes that human rights are essential to addressing the broad causes and impacts of all complex crises. This is exactly what we are faced with today. Navigating the way out of the COVID-19 crisis and towards an inclusive, green, sustainable, and resilient future is the responsibility and the opportunity of all of us, but especially of the leaders today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilse, for setting the frame for our conversation today and to emphasizing that to be truly sustainable recovery needs to put human rights at its heart and also be inclusive and build that broad alliance that ensures that we have all hands on deck for this daunting task ahead of us. You already mentioned the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, and we will now move to the first panel of today that will discuss exactly that pledge that speaks to sustainable recovery with human rights at its heart. This pledge was initiated by Denmark and launched recently during a session of the Human Rights Council. And it's now my pleasure to give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Martin Bille Hermann. Martin, why is it that Denmark initiated the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, and what is this about?
Thanks, Birgitte. Thanks for giving me the floor, and good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening, depending a little bit on where you. Birgitte, thank you so much for giving me the chance to address you today and to speak a little bit about the Sustainable Recovery Pledge. Now, this is a commitment to a human rights-centered and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is a gigantic challenge, but it also offers us a unique opportunity, if you like, to reimagine the world and accelerate much needed action in order to live up to the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. But to do that, I think we have to recognize that to truly build back better and greener, we need to place human rights front and center. Because development without respect for human rights and the future of our planet is simply not sustainable. And human rights needs to be right there, integrated in all things we do. It's a sideshow. It is not an afterthought. It needs to be at the heart. Now, unfortunately, the pandemic has been used as a pretext for violating human rights and fundamental freedoms. And across the globe, we see worrying tendencies of backtracking on basic human rights, in particular the rights of women and girls, already marginalized groups, and by what seems to be shrinking civic space and backtracking on democratic principles. And this is the wrong direction for us to take. And this is essentially why Denmark launched the Sustainable Recovery Pledge in Geneva during a session on the Human Rights Council. And we did this together with 47 countries that are committed to a human rights-based approach to sustainable COVID-19 recovery. And I think with the pledge, a significant number of UN member states have expressed their determination to build back better and use the 2030 Agenda grounded in states' human rights obligations, as well as the Paris Agreement as the blueprint for doing that. And allow me to underline a little bit why the human rights obligations of states and governments are so important. Because as much as we need the advocacy, expertise, and engagement from civil society, we will not succeed without the political will and commitment from world leaders. So all our talk about partnership should not be an excuse for world leaders and governments to, if you like, sort of abscond for their primary responsibility to turn aspirations and political will into action on the ground. And ultimately, it's the states that have signed on to the human rights declarations and the Paris Agreement, and that has to set the direction for the world. So I'd like to thank UN agencies, civil society organizations, and especially the 47 member states for signing and supporting the pledge. I'm encouraged that actually so many were determined to seize this opportunity to build a better forward. But there's clearly some way to go. No? The magic number is 193. So there is some way to go from 47 to 193. And human rights, in particular for those who are most vulnerable, have always been an unfulfilled promise. But now is the time to not let them out of sight or out of mind. So we need to get to work and need to be guided by the principles that we have agreed, and to some extent simply be guided by the opening words of the UN Charter, we the peoples know. So all of you who have not done so yet, who haven't found the opportunity, this is it. Join the Sustainable Recovery Pledge. Put human rights at the center of what we do. Put people at the center of what we do. It's a commitment to give prominence to the rights of every human being and a promise of leaving no one behind. We need as many on board as possible. So let me just leave you with this message. Having human rights as our North Star is our chance to deliver for everyone and to leave no one behind. Joining the Sustainable Recovery Pledge is one part of getting there. It's a commitment to do so. And then we cannot miss this historic opportunity of building back better from the pandemic. We simply owe it to the many victims around the world and to all of those that have seen their lives made poorer, seen themselves marginalized. Putting human rights at the heart of our recovery is the only way to truly make the Sustainable Development Goals a reality for all. Thanks, Birgitte.
Thank you so much, Martin, also for underlining that this is a challenge that we have to turn into an opportunity, and we have the opportunity to choose a different path, including with respect to the much needed climate action that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. We also heard that there are 47 states that have signed the pledge, but more are most welcome, and also civil society organizations and networks can actually support the pledge. It's my honor now to introduce the permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Mr. Satyendra Prasad. And Fiji is one of the 47 countries that have already signed the pledge. So, Your Excellency, how is Fiji aligning its pandemic response and recovery with human rights, with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, while also ensuring that no one is left behind? Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator and colleagues and everyone tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me to make a few comments. Fiji is very proud and happy to be part of the Sustainable Recovery Pledge. It places human rights at the center stage, as my dear colleague Martin has just said, of sustainable recovery. There is no, without doubt, there is no question about the recovery being different from the ways in which we have approached economic development in the pre-COVID period. It has to be different. It has to feel. It has to look different. And we'll give a slight different angle to the way in which my colleague Martin presented. I think 2030 is the global goal in 2030 is the North Star. And protection of human rights is the vehicle that helps us get there. It is the modality through which we accelerate, through which we elevate our path to achieving all of the human rights. And I say this in a special way. In Fiji's case, the Constitution and its Bill of Rights provides overall protection of all fundamental rights and freedoms. It is not now that when we, a country like many others, hurting very badly, is thinking about how to reposition the economies, how to rebuild, how to think about, for example, it's a large, very globalized tourism industry. There is a unique, historic, and a exciting opportunity to approach this recovery from a very human rights driven approach. And let me give you some examples of this. Women are disproportionately engaged in the tourism sector, and this is one of the sectors that has been worst hit. In Fiji's case, this whole sector has been in deep freeze for 14 months or so. It is also a sector that employs disproportionate number of women, and these were the first sets of jobs that went as the industry shut down. A different type of tourism will be a more circular tourist industry, a more sustainable tourist industry that looks a bit less like an extractive industry and much more focused on the planetary goals, on sustainability in oceans, on protection and regeneration of oceans, and investing in the planetary goals, and that the economic outcomes that are coming out of that must lead to increase in jobs and broaden livelihoods, etc. Fundamental to this is ensuring that women are at are part of this recovery, that the types of jobs that are created are jobs that are secure, that reduce the levels of the types of variabilities that women faced, or uncertainties that those type of employment were subject to in this sector. So that's one part of thinking about how human rights helps drive the recovery. The second set, so Fiji is a small island state. It's we say, but that is no longer true. On the front lines of climate change, the whole globe is now on the front line of climate change. This has impacts on all communities, on all individuals, and all countries. Nevertheless, we have seen time and again that women very much feel the disproportionate impacts of climate catastrophes. And 2 or 3 examples I will give of how human rights based approach is helping us reframe our response to the climate crisis. One part is that we are relocating about 45 communities to higher ground and to safer ground. And in relocation of communities is very hard work. You have to relocate services and homes and churches and schools and everything else that goes with it. The approach Fiji has taken is a fundamentally human rights driven, premised approach that when you put human rights as the way in which you frame the relocation of communities, the overall impact is much more sustainable, is of course much more inclusive, and the chances of success and mediating the outcomes are reduced. So that's, and the related to that is that this approach to fighting climate crisis must be driven by legal frameworks. There cannot be ad hoc government policy done in response to one catastrophe or the other. And so I'm very happy to say that part of the Sustainable Recovery Pledge builds on Fiji's efforts to build a climate law, climate act that firmly commits us to all our climate goals and to the human rights foundations of the climate goals. And related to that is an oceans, national oceans policy that is also going to be, not yet, but going to be locked into law. So human rights is very much the foundation of driving and showing us the pathway towards achieving the SDGs in 2030. And I very much also join you and colleagues in inviting other countries to join this pledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's really encouraging also to hear the concrete examples of how you are using human rights as the framework, as the North Star, even when the going gets tough and you have to reallocate communities, etc. And I'm sure our colleagues from the Women's Major Group, who will also speak later, they already appreciate how you talked very strongly about the gendered impact of the COVID pandemic in Fiji. We are now moving from Fiji to Costa Rica, which is another country that has signed the pledge and which also has a track record of pursuing a sustainable development path. It's my pleasure now to introduce Deputy Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Maritza Chan. Ambassador, can you share with us how Costa Rica is aligning its recovery from COVID-19 with human rights, with the 2030 Agenda, and with the Paris Agreement. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to this event. It's an honor to be here. In order to respond to this question, let me start by stating that at the national level, Costa Rica expanded social safety networks instead of restricted them. And with the belief that expanding welfare and social protection lays the groundwork for an inclusive and resilient, sustainable recovery. And the data shows that this approach was the right one. Our institutions develop new benefits and public services ranging from hotlines to prevent and combat gender violence, nutritional supplements for people with disabilities, preventive residence for older adults with COVID-19, joint efforts between public institutions, and support to cooperative or small and medium businesses. All of this was tailored for economically vulnerable or recently jobless citizens navigate the road back to financial stability. It also makes sure that no one was left out. We drafted policies to specifically ensure that our refugee population enjoy complete and full access to the labor market, public and public services, and training and certification opportunities. For Costa Rica, one of the most powerful lessons for the COVID-19 is that the health of the people is directly related to the health of the planet. Before the pandemic, many of us will not fully appreciate the impact chain between urban-rural interfaces to wet markets to global medical crisis to international economic collapses. But the past year has shown us that such seemingly disparate interlinkages are close, swift, and immense. Indeed, Costa Rica is humbled by the call to preserve our natural environments that is presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 was literally and metaphorically a force of nature. Thus, Costa Rica put ecological preservation and sustainable development at the center of our recovery roadmap. With our 2015 long-term strategy and national decarbonization plan, Costa Rica launched a sustainable recovery strategy based on a new development model focused on the major changes facing the world economy today. It highlights the need to move towards a sustainable economy where economic development does not damage our natural capital. It includes a threshold for the implementation of the SDGs in 2030 and another one for 2050, responding to our decarbonization goals. Notably, these strategies were all grounded in rigorous scientific data and research. One of the most salient reminders of the pandemic is that evidence-based, impartial, and data scientific research must guide policy. At the international level, Costa Rica maintains that sustainable COVID recovery requires pivoting national budgets from militarization and weaponry to human health and security. Regrettably and inexplicably, military expenditure increased during the pandemic to with almost $3 billion last year, an increase of 2.6% in real terms from 2019, according to new data published by CIPRI. Investing in weapons instead of health and security is short-sighted and counterproductive, particularly when the vast majority of the world remains unvaccinated, literally fearing for their lives. A rigorous and honest reflection of priorities is necessary at the national and global level to make concrete steps forward post-pandemic. And as we have heard before, Costa Rica reiterates that states of emergency are not the time to neglect human rights. There are a time when they need to be bolstered. Human rights are the core of sustainable, inclusive policy which serves state governments and their constituents best in the long term. Observing the crisis and its impacts through a human rights lens puts a focus on how it is affecting people on the ground, particularly the most vulnerable among us, and what we can be done about it now and in the long term. In this way, we know that the United Nations is uniquely equipped to tackle the global impact of COVID-19 and its detriment on human rights. Accordingly, fulfilling our human rights program and budget for 2022, what is specifically meaningful for us, it is essential that the United Nations has the resources to perform its mandate and our mandate in our commitment with human rights. A new reality, it's a powerful vehicle for change, and it gives us the opportunity to raise common ambition with a great boost to international cooperation, focused on a resilient and sustainable recovery that means that the urgent needs of our people. We must ensure that no one is left behind in this process to achieve a future that is less inequality and with more opportunity. In other words, the pandemic shows us that we must take the long view and the high ground, and we have done so in Costa Rica. I thank you.
Thank you so much for the inspiration, Costa Rica. I also noted that you started by highlighting that you have expanded social protection coverage. We recently asked the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty what was the single most important thing states could do in the context of the pandemic, and his answer was exactly that. So very inspiring. I also noted that you're already looking beyond 2030. So when the rest of us have to start considering the 2050 agenda, we will definitely look to Costa Rica for inspiration. To round up this panel, we have now with us Senior Research Fellow from the Overseas Development Institute, Mr. Soumya Chattopadhyay. Since 2017, the ODI has measured the leaving no one behind aspect of the 2030 agenda at the country level. You have measured countries' readiness to meet their commitment to leaving no one behind, as well as the actual outcomes in that regard. So when you look back at your 2020 analysis, what is it that you see? Has the pandemic impacted countries' readiness? And what is required to ensure a recovery that leaves no one behind? Over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. Good afternoon to everyone from here in London, regardless of what time zone you are in. It's a privilege to be able to sort of contribute and be in the same room as all of you. Some of you are on the chat. If I could, can I just share my screen because I had a few slides to go through. Please let me know if once.
Yes, that's fine. If you can share your screen.
Yeah, I have. Please, if you could just show me a thumbs up to say when it's up. Okay. Okay. We've been creating, as Bridget said, we've been creating this Leave No One Behind index since 2017. In fact, it coincided with the HLPF in 2017 that triggered us into doing this. So it's a sort of series of similar comparable analysis that we have done, and this is a snapshot for some of the findings that are pertinent to the discussion that we are having and a very relevant discussion that we are having today. I definitely encourage people to sort of also dig deeper into the sort of methodology and the sort of concepts and the findings. I'm just presenting a few snapshots, so please, my apologies if it just runs through very quickly. So when we created this index, we basically wanted to do two sorts of index. I mean, it's a complement of two indices. One is measuring how countries are prepared or preparing the groundwork for putting in place systems that can actually bring about more inclusive access to opportunities for well-being and development. So one is the readiness index. The other is what has been the outcome of it in terms of visible, measurable progress towards a few select SDG targets. In fact, we chose the targets which specifically have in them an element of equity in terms of disaggregation of meeting the needs of the most vulnerable, typically the poor, but minority, children, women, and so on. So there's a lot of mechanics which goes under it. I'll just gloss over it for now to come to the sort of more pertinent results part of the story, which is when we look at the readiness index, the good news is that nearly half of the countries in our sample of 159 countries are actually, by our standards, kind of close to being ready to create conducive conditions for leaving no one behind. There is a slight caveat here that it has slightly declined from the previous iteration that we did in 2019. So the way we set up these indices, it is a span of a couple of years. And so you have to keep investing in it. It's not a one-shot gain that actually gets you up to a standard. To have that label of you being ready as a country, you have to keep investing, keep improving on where you were in the past. So while it's good news, the sort of slight concern is that there's been slight slippage, and the slippage actually has happened in some of the countries which traditionally are the high-income countries or the upper middle-income countries as well. So while some countries from lower middle-income countries and low-income countries have moved up in the scale, the others have kind of fallen back a bit. So that's one concern. But the more interesting story here is how we look. I mean, when we disaggregate it by country income levels, we find that the low-income countries are really struggling. None of them, not one of them, is actually in the ready category. And on the other extreme, we have nearly 70% of the high-income countries which have actually reached the readiness thresholds. So please bear in mind, I'll come to this point just in a short while, that there is a high level of correlation between the country income level as well as then the fiscal capacity of those countries to invest in systems to creating conditions that can actually make sure that the development opportunities are equitable, especially for the most vulnerable communities. We have different thematic elements within this, and one of them is data. Do you have good disaggregated systematic data to actually analyze who's left behind and who's not? Do you have finances which meeting two internationally agreed thresholds for meeting some of the basic commitments in health, education, and social protection? And do you have policies which actually guarantee that those who tend to be left behind are protected by law, both on paper and in practice? And we expected that finance and data are going to be associated, correlated with country income. What we also found surprisingly is that policy making itself is also fairly correlated with your country income level. So political will apparently goes hand in hand with the sort of fiscal capacity of the country. So there's some questions to be asked here about aspirations, about opportunities, about what is the intent of the political capital? Can it be actually sustained? Can it be created if you are a low-income country? So these are sort of open questions for policymakers to look into. Turning back to the other complementary side, which is the overall outcome, the story is similar to the readiness, which is the largest group are what we call are on track to delivering the sort of inclusive targets of SDGs. But again, in this, when we look at the income classification division, we again find that, again, it's the same story of low-income countries really struggling. Not one country is on track to these sort of benchmarks that we have created. On the other hand, none of the high-income countries are off track. So there is this cascade of both in the preparedness as well as, or readiness, as well as in the overall outcomes that seems to suggest that, well, country income levels really do matter a lot. And then we sort of looked at the correlation. We actually did find that is the ones which are ready in readiness tend to be the ones which are better prepared, are on track in the outcome. And the ones who are not ready or partially ready seem to be the one who have made partial progress. And the ones who have insufficient data, well, we can't say anything, but again, the not ready typically leads to a country being off track. And so these are sort of percentages that we can summarize with. So the key message here is that there is a good news that the largest groups are the ones who are ready in terms of readiness index, as well as on track in terms of outcome measures. But the not so good news, or the concerning bit, is that they are correlated with country income level. So you could end up being in a vicious cycle where you're a low income country with no pathway, natural pathway to come out of it, and you're a virtuous country at a very high level of equilibrium where you have all the elements which support each other sort of all aligned up. So in other words, you don't have the you have two hotspots and no way to perhaps migrate from the less desirable to the more desirable. So that's a sort of very active policy making. That's where active policy making can actually break that sort of vicious cycle. In terms of COVID-19 impact, we will be the first one to say that this data predates that.
If you can wrap up in just
yeah, sure.
Exactly. Seconds. Thank you.
So given the elements of it, we can actually see that there are multiple themes that can come in. We worry that it actually might exacerbate this difference between the haves and the have-nots, or someone as the economist put it, as the jabs and the jab-nots. Countries which are caught in the low-level equilibrium might not be able to graduate into the conditions of readiness and outcome that the high-level income or the upper middle-income countries have done so. With that, I take it back to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much for sharing these very interesting findings and the mixed news, both the positive and the negative. And I think it really speaks to the element of international solidarity and cooperation, SDG 10, etc. So thanks a lot for sharing that. We will now move on to the next panel on civil society participation in sustainable recovery, which is also a crucial element of the Sustainable Recovery Pledge. In practice, we know that a series of fundamental freedoms, civil and political rights have been severely restricted and impacted during the pandemic. So it's now my immense pleasure to introduce the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association, Mr. Clément Boulet, who very actively has used his mandate during the pandemic. So Clément, how has the pandemic impacted the space for civil society? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and thanks also. Good morning, good afternoon. A year and a half into the pandemic, we can affirm that the impact on democracy and civic space have been severe. Some governments have tried to respond to the pandemic with a human rights approach, and I have, in many occasions, commended those efforts. Yet, as we fear, the crisis has been used by many governments as a pretext to cement control and crack down on civil society rather than ensuring public health. In doing so, the response to the crisis has accelerated trends of closing civic space, which were already underway before the pandemic. The abuse of emergency law and the militaristic approach to the pandemic are at the heart of the problem. While emergency law can be fully justified for countering COVID-19, many have been far-reaching. For example, many assembly bans imposed in emergency measure have been obsolete, with no exception for social distance, peaceful protests, or the ability to adapt these measures to country context. In several cases, authority decisions of assembly ban was heavily enforced during opposition protest movement. Curfew stay at home order and other movement restrictions have kept civil society organizations and their staff from delivering life-saving services. States conducted surveillance during this period and employed excessive force and harsh criminal sanctions to enforce these restrictions. The exclusion of civil society organizations include trade unions in the planning and implementation of COVID-19 response is also part of the trend. My mandate received information of obstacles to register association and access to funding. Cases where labor representative face retaliation for speaking out concerning dangerous situations at the workplace have also been very common. This is even more so for civil society group and community representing marginalized group. The danger is that these law and practice become normalized and accepted as the appropriate way to respond to crisis. This is very problematic for a world that is already facing several crises, from climate change to the rising of global poverty. So it is important that we learn from this crisis as we are moving to recovery plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clement, for sharing these insights, and we will come back to you also. But first, let me introduce Mandeep Tiwana, who is the Chief Program Officer at Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. So Mandeep, how has civil society responded to the changes in civic space and the impacts of the pandemic?
Thank you, Birgit, and thank you very much to Danish Institute of Human Rights and all the organizers today. So to answer your question, civil society has responded as it always does in the face of a crisis, with ingenuity, with commitment, and with a aspiration to leave no one behind. I mean, even as civic space restrictions were taking place on so many levels, which the Special Rapporteur has spoken about, civil society organizations were providing relief to impoverished and excluded communities. They were staffing domestic violence helplines. They were providing psychological support to victims. They were also helping governments to ensure that policy making is inclusive, that takes into account the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized in our societies. In fact, civil society organizations were also spreading credible information about the COVID-19 spread, how people can protect themselves during the pandemic. Now, if we look at civic space and we look at civil society participation, we need to see that it really supports transparency, accountability, and participation in Agenda 2030. The Agenda 2030 is a marked change from the Millennium Development Goals, which didn't have a rights-based approach, which weren't universal, which didn't believe in the interdependence of rights. Now, Agenda 2030 believes in all of this, and civil society is the key to unlocking the potential of the agenda. So mobilizations continue to take place despite all of the restrictions that were put on civil society. Civil society was involved in court cases. Civil society was putting out petitions. Civil society was engaging with public officials, with the media, to promote a more rights-based approach and better achievement of Agenda 2030 throughout the pandemic. I just wanted to share a few examples. The global conversation around racial justice continued last year in the middle of a pandemic. The Black Lives Matter protests have really changed our thinking of how the racial justice and systemic discrimination against Black people has impacted our societies over the years. Women's sexual and reproductive rights continue to remain on the center. In fact, there's been changes in legislation in Argentina. There's been calls for better protection of women's rights in Poland and elsewhere. There were mobilizations to continue better economic policies that ensure protection of rights of farmers, for instance, in India, which continued. There were mobilizations to highlight the bungling and official responses by civil society using innovative forms of protest, like placing crosses in front of government buildings in other countries, including in Brazil. So they have all of these civil society activities continued during the pandemic. Yet the three challenges that the Special Rapporteur highlighted also remain extremely problematic. These are censorship, to prevent government responses from being made public to the people. Second is overarching surveillance, to prevent civil society's ability to speak truth to power and expose wrongdoing. And the third is the excessive giving of powers to law enforcement agencies in the name of COVID-19 emergency measures, which again impedes the right to democratic dissent. Let me stop here and hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Mandeep. And I think you have emphasized how a vibrant civil society is an enormous and also indispensable element and a contribution to sustainable development. We will also come back to you, but let me now turn to Shaima Ali, who is the organizing partner of the Women's Major Group for the Middle East and North Africa region. So Shaima, zooming in on the MENA region, how has the pandemic impacted the realization of SDGs and human rights from a women's and also from a civil society perspective? Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, esteemed panel members and attendants. The global pandemic has exposed the terrible legacy of unfair policies, as we all know, that have heightened inequality, discrimination, and oppression, and paved the way for the devastation brought by COVID-19 within the Arab states. Across the Middle East and North Africa, existing inequalities in the enjoyment of economic and social rights and a culture of entrenched discrimination left some groups of people, including women, refugees, migrants, people with disabilities, and minorities, negatively affected by the pandemic. And the protracted humanitarian crisis in our region made the situation even worse. Because of the 60 million displaced people worldwide, close to 40%, as you all know, originate from the Arab region. On the other hand, the pandemic also aggravated the already vulnerable situation of migrant workers in our region, especially women across Arab states, including Gulf Cooperation Council countries, where there are more than 80% of workers are migrants from developing countries. Moreover, health workers on the front lines of the pandemic in our region suffered a lot as a result of neglected and overstretched health systems and the pitiful social protection measures in place. Many of Arab states responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by declaring a state of emergency and long lockdowns, even till now, or in some cases, passing dedicated legislations that created additional restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly. However, while Middle East and North Africa governments have resorted to repressive means to reduce critics over their responses to the pandemic, across the region, people have continued to demand their right to health and justice, as in countries like Morocco and Tunisia. No question that the impact on the Sustainable Development Goals implementation process and the Agenda 2030 nationalization in the region was severely impacted. The voluntary national reviews were dropped out by some of our countries, while other reviews were relatively sketchy, with no real engagement, in fact, of the civil society organizations due to the pandemic regulations of social distancing and the lack of IT-based effective tools to ensure holding realistic consultative meetings. The SDG number 5, specifically on gender equality in particular, was negatively affected because like women all around the globe, Arab women were at the front line of the COVID-19 response and suffered from expanding unpaid care burdens and gender-based violence, according to many UN reports. The region-specific restrictive social norms, structural barriers, and legal frameworks exacerbate the obstacles faced by our women. Hence, the region's long-term recovery will actually depend on its ability to fully leverage the potentials of both women and men and have a human rights-based recovery approach. Lockdowns and curfew measures also increased the high rates of domestic violence across the region, due to factors such as mounting concerns over job insecurity, cramped living spaces for large families, for example, reduced services, and difficulty even to report the violence at home through the lockdown, and the restrictive social norms, which are sometimes enshrined in the country's legal frameworks in place. We, as feminists and women major group members, are encouraging always our governments to put together economic and social programs to counteract the impact of the pandemic, and preparing the post-crisis relaunch, considering the pledge to sustainable recovery that leaves no one behind. The COVID-19 pandemic represents actually an opportunity for our region to address the structural issues facing women and girls in Middle East and North Africa. Several governments in our region have already taken important steps to integrate a gender perspective in the elaboration of their COVID-19 immediate response, working closely with national women organizations and international organizations to achieve equitable recovery plans. These efforts, if continued, could pave the way for a systematic adoption of gender mainstreaming and the human rights-based approach in social and economic policies across the region. This is important not only for furthering women's economic empowerment, but also greatly benefits the region economies in the future. In the end, I am really glad to join you all today, and thanks a lot for the attention. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shaima, for highlighting both the challenges, but also the very important contributions, including of migrant workers, a group that had not been mentioned previously, but of course also women. I think across the three panelists, we saw that response measures affect fundamental freedoms and also exacerbate and aggravate existing inequalities or negative trends. So I think we have time to go back to actually the three of you with a very brief question and some very brief remarks to also pick your brains on what is actually required for civil society to effectively participate in the recovery. Clément, you have defined 10 key principles or indicators for states to pursue a human rights compliant response to the pandemic. What is it that states need to do for civil society to effectively participate in recovery?
Thank you again for giving me the floor, Bridget. As you mentioned, in April 2020, I issued a set of 10 principles for governments to ensure that while governments are taking measures to fight COVID-19, these measures can respect civic space and the fundamental freedom. And there are several recommendations in those and also another document that I present was also a guideline on civil society participation to the implementation of SDG. And in these two documents, there are some key recommendations that I would like. I don't have time now to go on each of them since I have, but I will focus on only mainly two aspects. One, the first aspect is to ensuring broad civil society participation in the development, oversight, and implementation of recovery plan. And for me, genuine consultation process should ideally be embedded in local and national development and planning process, thereby including civil society in the full range of activity leading to the achievement of the SDGs. And inclusive and meaningful dialogue should be organized regularly to ensure that the government measure and plan are evaluated and also are reviewed to adapt them in the, with the context. And full participation is particularly important to provide space in which the voices of those most at risk and marginalized can be raised and heard. And we need also in developing this plan to take into account digital divided in the designing of the local mechanism of participation. The second aspect that I want also to highlight is the international solidarity, which is really needed today more than ever. Government should ensure civil society ability to seek, receive, and use resources from national, foreign, and international sources in order to do their work. And this is a part of their right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. But also donor country should ensure that the way in which they provide financial support also enable civil society organizations to effectively address COVID-19 recovery and the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And flexible, one way will be the flexible funding for civil society partner, including through core or institutional funding, allowing them to respond quickly to the circumstances and the demands on the ground. We need also to focus in providing this funding we need also to focus on women-led and local organization, because they are the ones also that are close to the most people in the need, and they know how to really approach those marginalized groups. And I think another important thing that I would like also to say on that is that our ability to overcome and recover from COVID-19 and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal depend on the survival of civil society and the health of civic space. And as I mentioned in the beginning, government need to think that civil society should be considered as a partner in addressing crisis, not as enemy. And without civil society, it is hard to see how the 2030 agenda can be succeed. My last point in terms of international solidarity is also to ensure the universal access to vaccine, because this is important to ensure also that civil society working in global south have access to this vaccine. As you know, many governments, repressive governments, are using today argument that they don't have access to this vaccine. So to maintain against some of those restrictions that we are seeing on the civic space, we need to ensure that by also ensuring that vaccine reach those people, some of these governments do not have any arguments or do not use COVID-19 as a pretext to continue to maintain this restriction that undermine civic space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clément. And I would really encourage participants to also visit the website of the Special Rapporteur. I think there's a lot of very interesting material to find there. And I think it also illustrates the very timely and high quality guidance that have come out of international human rights mechanisms in the context of the pandemic. You also mentioned a number of elements that are also reflected in the Sustainable Recovery Pledge that we have talked about here. The quality participation, not as an one-off event, but as a process. The importance of tech overcoming the digital divide, international cooperation and funding, and the view at civil society as a resource, as a partner in development. Mandeep, I will now hand over to you with the same question. What are your recommendations to state to ensure effective participation?
Thank you. The Special Rapporteur has already made several good points, which which we agree with and support wholeheartedly. I would say that the first thing that governments need to do is that recognize that there are commitments on civic space and civil society participation within Agenda 2030. There are commitments on access to information and fundamental freedoms. There are commitments on responsive, inclusive, and participatory decision making, and there are commitments on effective civil society partnerships. Yet we see that the gap between commitments and practice is quite wide. Of the 44 countries that are participating in this year's high-level political forum, our research through the Civicus Monitor, which is a participatory platform that measures the core civic freedoms of assembly, association, and expression, finds that only 11 actually have enabling civic spaces. They are listed within the open category on the Civicus Monitor. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, the most important thing is that governments need to recognize that without civil society, transparency, accountability, and participation in relation to Agenda 2030 is severely weakened. Without civil society having civic space, the ability of civil society to ensure this is stymied deeply. So respecting the right to democratic dissent is absolutely critical. And that is where civil society rights, civic space is reduced because governments don't like to hear criticism. They don't like to hear civil society's uncovering of abuses and governance failures. But governments have a choice. They have a choice because there's a vast body of international law. There's a vast body of constitutional law that protects the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. In fact, the Human Rights Committee, which is an expert body of jurists tasked with interpreting the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has issued a general comment on the right to peaceful assembly, which is General Comment 37 just last year. Now, this General Comment 37 could be used by governments to actually enhance and better their own legislation and their own practices. So, which will allow civil society to mobilize and to make changes that are in the interests of all of society and that are the interests of constitutional values. Equally importantly, governments can take efforts to include civil society in decision making by including civil society on national task forces, by including civil society in planning commissions and in other advisory boards which are linked to the political executive. In fact, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, there are some good examples from Sierra Leone, where civil society was included in governmental task forces and responses in relation to COVID-19. There are also good examples from Austria, where in the stimulus package, there was allocations made for civil society to get funding to be able to continue its good work, which which we've been speaking about in the conversation before. So it's really therefore really important to create these enabling environments and for government officials also to publicly express support for civil society and to ensure that law enforcement agencies properly investigate any attacks on civil society, whether by repressive state apparatuses, whether by criminal elements in the private sector, or whether by any anti-rights groups that promote hate or ideology that stands against the values that civil society seeks to promote of social justice and human rights. So I spoke a little bit about the national level, but at the international level, at the UN level also, there needs to be more movement on involving civil society. We find that across the UN, across UN offices, across UN agencies, across UN departments, there's an asymmetry in civil society participation. Some offices and agencies do very well, but other offices and agencies could do much better in involving civil society in their work. So therefore, we need more consistent practices here. And many of us in civil society are calling for improved measures to ensure better civil society participation, particularly in light of the UN Secretary General presenting our Common Agenda report, which is in response to the declaration to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And here there are three issues that have come forward through the We the People's campaign that Civicus is promoting along with several other organizations. One is that we need a high-level civil society envoy that carries out a audit across the UN agencies and departments to see what are the bottlenecks, what are the challenges about civil society participation, and also to drive outreach to civil society across UN offices, agencies, departments. The second is a UN citizens initiative where a critical mass of global citizens can bring an issue for action by the UN General Assembly and Security Council. It could be in relation to conflict, it could be in relation to a thematic issue like migration or climate justice, or it could be an issue in relation to a particular country where severe challenges are imperiling the achievement of the values of the UN Charter. And the third is to find some sort of people's representation at the UN. Current UN representation is oftentimes dictated by state interests, by the interests of the political executive. But if there is a way that we can have some sort of direct representation of people at the UN through a parliamentary assembly, it may be an idea which might be considered by some to be ahead of its time, but we should not discount it at this point of time, especially as we would take the United Nations into the 21st century and in line with the aspirations of people's participation and the opening words of the UN Charter, which begin, "We the peoples." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mandeep, for these very constructive and forward-looking proposals and recommendations about opening space at all levels, not only at the national level, but also within the UN system and in such processes. I also noted your remarks about the commitment to fundamental freedoms and participation within the 2030 agenda embedded in the SDGs. And of course, these are then underpinned by the similar obligations that states have already committed to under the human rights framework. And that speaks exactly to what you mentioned, the opportunity for us to use the guidance that are coming out of international human rights mechanisms and bodies to reach the, to realize human rights and the SDGs. And in that context, perhaps I should also mention the importance of our sister organizations, the national human rights institutions that have played a crucial role in many countries during the pandemic to keep that space open for civil society and to push for a human rights-based approach to response and recovery in the context of COVID. Shaima, we hope that you are still with us, that you have not lost your connection. If you're there, perhaps you're there. I see you now. Very good. Perhaps we can ask, what do you see from the MENA region? What do we need to ensure civil society and women's participation in your region?
Yes, this is very important because our region, for example, like giving an example about how we are operating as civil society organizations, while there are coordination mechanisms for the forums as a regional forums for sustainable development. However, for example, in Middle East and North Africa, we don't have such coordination mechanisms. So we are trying every year to coordinate, of course, with the custodian agency, ESCO in this case, in order to create this civil society space through the Arab Forum for Sustainable Development. So this is one example how we are operating, I mean, regionally. However, I was thinking about specific recommendations for our region, including in response to this question, including, of course, the engagement mechanisms, as I stated, for civil society and having in place effective coordination mechanisms regionally, as I said, ahead of the forums for sustainable development, especially the Arab Forum for Sustainable Development in our case. I believe that it is very important in order to create this linkage between the local or national level and the regional level. Secondly, we as civil society organizations and civil society actors in the region, we are suffering a lot right now, of course, due to the severe cuts in terms of the funding. So the non-government organizations and civil society organizations trying to diversify the funding resources and to have more, I would say, engaging resource mobilization strategies. So continue funding and providing resources to the civil society organizations in our region and enhance the civil spaces provided to them, especially women-led civil society organizations, as Clement said before, in order to work hand in hand with the government to provide services that were affected through the pandemic is quite important, because some of our civil society organizations, especially in protracted humanitarian contexts, are actually service providers. So right now they are suffering a lot in order to continue providing services and help governments, especially hosting governments, like in Jordan, for example, to respond through the pandemic, providing, for example, reproductive health care and sexual reproductive health services. So this is very important to maintain this streams of funding for the civil society organizations, especially which are working in such severe conditions. Third, I would think about enhancing the knowledge sharing platforms among civil society actors in our between regions. So regional civil society knowledge sharing platforms are quite important, which can be achieved, of course, through the UN major groups. That's the rule we are actually working on to enhance this always consultations between regions and between feminists from Middle East, from South and North in general. So this dialogue and maintaining such open dialogue, I believe that it's creating this more diversified debates, which in fact enhancing our dialogues between each other, and of course learn from experiences and good practices between regions. So this is something I would emphasize on. And also it's important to encourage and push our governments to not consider civil society organizations as, I would say, auxiliary bodies with some specific agendas in our region, especially. Rather, they have to look at them or consider them as integrated bodies who are and can be effective partners that can achieve the Universal Sustainable Recovery Pledge, of course, we have right now, which leaves no one behind through this important process. So it will also emphasize the human rights-based approach which we are seeking. So considering the civil society organizations as our region as cooperative partners, not some specific bodies or auxiliary bodies with specific, I would say, harmful agendas, which sometimes this is the image we have in our region. It's quite important. So maybe discussing this with the government through important forums or important spaces as HLPF is quite important to enhance this image that we are actually can be an effective tool, or I would say effective partner to achieve the pledge and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals at end, of course. Finally, I would like to say also or speak about the IT and digital spaces, which are proved to be an important tool through such a crisis, especially if we will be facing such a situation in future. Therefore, I think that investing in creating digital spaces and providing reliable IT services in our region and tools that enable us all, especially marginalized groups and vulnerable women groups in our region as refugees and migrants and women with disability, is very important to always hear them and know their demands through such a critical time. Considering also digital violence and bullying right now, which we see escalating through the pandemic, it's very important to, I would say that to have this digital protection for the feminists and the human rights defenders, because we are actually witnessing escalation of cyberbullying, as I would say, against the human rights defenders, feminists, which are actually increasing through such critical time. So I believe that creating safe digital spaces is quite important, and it needs a lot of investment in our region to maintain this system and to be able to speak up through such a critical time and of course create these linkages between our women and feminists in the region, because it's quite, I would say that the situation gets more jeopardizing through the pandemic time. Also, we do understand
sorry,
that lockdown.
Shaima, I think your time is up now, so if you can please.
Yes, last point is about the lockdowns and some restrictions for social distancing. We understand that it's quite important. However, we need to have consultations ahead of such lockdowns and severe measures, because in fact they are affecting women in our region more and more, especially increment of GBV and domestic violence. So ahead of this, we have to firstly ensure that there is a consultation process with civil society actors, and also to ensure that there is a remote services that can receive the reports and complaints and to act for the GBV cases in our region. This is quite important. So this is my last point, and thank you so much, Bridget.
Thank you so much to you and to the other two panelists. I think you have really proven your words that civil society has so much to contribute. So thank you so much for that. And I also want to underline that both Civicus and Women's Major Group are among the civil society networks that support the Sustainable Recovery Pledge and hopefully can help translate this into action on the ground. Well, we're now turning to our last panel of today, and we know that in order to succeed with sustainable recovery, we need massive investments from multiple sources. So last but not least, we will now turn to our panel on private sector investments and the need to align business operations with human rights and the SDGs, including using the UN guiding principles on business and human rights as our guide and benchmark for such business performance. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Theo van der Merwe, who is Policy Officer at Transparency International. So Theo, what are the risks associated with the significant investments in pandemic response and recovery that you see, and how can these risks be monitored and mitigated? You have the floor.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah. So, I mean, through our work at Transparency International throughout the pandemic, we've seen a number of areas of challenge emerge that do pose a threat to the response and to the money that's being dedicated towards it. I would say the first one that we highlight is that in many cases there are flawed public contracting systems. So months into the pandemic, many governments are still purchasing goods and services following fast-track procedures that often lack the proper planning and oversight needed, and that this tends to heighten the risks that sorely needed resources are lost or are able to be leaked out. Relevant information on these procurements are often really hard to find and also inaccessible. So in one analysis that we had conducted, on the implementation of transparency commitments in a selection of just 100 procurement processes in 4 countries, we found quite worrying indications on the insufficient amount of information that was there. So just on a few examples, in one case, and I won't name countries, but in one case, procurement websites were completely inaccessible without being inside the country and also not with a VPN. In other cases, there were very limited amounts of information published and only after a lot of public outcry. And in other cases, the information was scattered across multiple different websites. So in order to build a picture of, what took place with this particular procurement of PPE, we would have to consult multiple different websites that weren't linked together, and sort of took our own research to find that. I would say a second issue that we've seen is a general trend of weak oversight mechanisms with regards to COVID-19 spending. So last year, for example, we analyzed just 19 documented cases of COVID-19 corruption across a 5-month period, where an estimate had been provided about how much money had been lost to corruption or malfeasance. And the rounded total came to an astonishing $1.1 billion. And just to put that into perspective, it was enough to purchase 50,000 ventilators. So we know that these sort of leakages have really, really serious ramifications for the citizens for which this money is intended. And we've also seen numerous cases of fraud and wrongdoing that have been uncovered by auditing and law enforcement institutions, as well as investigative journalists. But it's clear that these oversight institutions also require greater support given the challenge that faces them. A third challenge that we've seen is a lack of relevant data to hold these authorities to account where they need to be held to account. So the data, as I mentioned earlier, the data needed to hold authorities to account is often hidden or is very difficult to find or is simply inaccessible. And to illustrate that, I mean, another analysis that we conducted of 100 public procurement processes of countries that had agreed to transparency commitments with the IMF upon receiving their loans, we discovered that the specifics of these commitments varied very vastly between countries, that many governments had pledged to publish public procurement contracts as well as the beneficial owners of companies that had been awarded contracts, and that others had committed to conducting independent audits and to publish these results. But we found that, unfortunately, the implementation of these commitments was often quite patchy. So, as one example, we found, I mentioned the examples already, like either they were completely inaccessible unless you were inside the country, or they were scattered across multiple websites and it was not very clear how to find this information. And the result of that is that for civil society, it's extremely difficult to monitor these resources, and it reduces our ability to ensure resources are indeed needed, that are indeed reaching those who need it most. So in terms of recommendations that we feel could help address these issues is, I would say the first would be to improve availability and the quality of public spending data, including government contracts. So this could include ensuring timely publication of contracting data in an open format, and that these are published in centralized platforms and not sort of scattered around multiple different government websites. Another would be to design more explicit rules and protocols for emergencies, and ensure that these are enforced so that we can, at the same time, engage in emergency processes, ensuring that these resources are delivered as fast as possible, but that they are done safely and that they do actually reach the people that need them. We also feel that risk assessments could prove very useful to focus resources on areas or processes that are more vulnerable to corruption. At the international level, so that's more national level initiatives that could be undertaken. At the international level, we have also looked quite extensively at the IMF's approach to handling corruption in its emergency lending, and noted that it relies very heavily on public oversight, particularly from civil society groups. We feel that the IMF could be more actively engaged in ensuring a robust implementation of the transparency commitments that they themselves have included in their lending programs. And this could include, for example, through heightened future surveillance and lending programs, or, for example, hosting a database of relevant documents to sort of standardize the format and facilitate universal access, and more generally just pursue a more consistent approach to assessing government implementation and then linking these findings to surveillance and to future lending transparency. Finally, we would encourage governments and lending institutions to publicly report on the level of the implementation of these transparency and anti-corruption commitments that they've made as part of their loan agreements, and that they also publish the audits to which they've committed to in a timely manner to maximize public confidence and set a good precedent. Another area we've looked at was the issue of beneficial ownership data. Many of the commitments that countries had signed onto when being given this loans was to ensure greater beneficial ownership transparency of companies that are receiving public funds or public tenders. And what we notice is that this has often been lacking across many countries throughout the pandemic, and that really presents a serious risk for malfeasance or for corruption. In almost all of the cases that we looked at, there was either insufficient identifying information about who were the real owners of these companies, and it was also not really specified how the information was going to be provided that they were supposed to disclose. And then I guess to round off, what are some of the solutions that can be done in these areas? Well, we feel quite strongly that oversight mechanisms should be enhanced through civic participation and monitoring. Ultimately through embracing clean contracting, governments can save lives and prevent the misuse of public money. But this requires transparency in spaces for independent oversight throughout the entire procurement process. And so we would be very pleased to see governments committing to making sure that all of this information on emergency release funds are available to internal auditors as well as independent auditors, and that as civil society, we would also be very happy to continue our efforts to monitor the quality of data and access to COVID-19 spending. Just to mention a few examples of
Theo, sorry, I think your time is really running out.
Okay,
so
sure.
If you could wrap up now, please.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think that's more or less the main points that I wanted to get through. And we look forward to working closely with these international institutions as well to sort of assist and encourage their monitoring efforts as well as national countries as well.
Thank you so much, Theo. And I also noticed a very recent publication by Transparency International and Equal Rights Trust that evidences the link between discrimination, inequality, and corruption. I think that's also a very essential read for addressing this topic as an element of sustainable recovery.
Absolutely.
Now I will turn to our final speaker, who is Charlotte Hagman, the Climate and Energy Benchmark Research Lead from the World Benchmarking Alliance, which focuses on transformative benchmarks that will compare companies' performance on the SDGs. So Charlotte, what risks and opportunities do you see in relation to private sector investment in the context of pandemic response and recovery? Over to you.
Thank you very much for your question. And on behalf of the World Benchmarking Alliance, thank you to the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is a highly valued ally of the WBA, as we're known, as well as thanks to Denmark, Costa Rica and Fiji for inviting us to this panel. The work of the World Benchmarking Alliance is to assess and rank companies on their contributions to sustainable development, to incentivize greater business action on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement goals. We at WBA place the social transformation at the heart of our benchmarks to drive transformational change to ensure that we leave no one behind in achieving sustainable development. Our work on this began with our corporate human rights benchmark in 2015 and now continues also with our core social assessments. These measure the performance of 2,000 globally influential companies, which sit within the scope of our work, and we measure them on the fundamentals of responsible business conduct, decent work, ethical action, and respect for human rights. And as such, these assessments are underpinned by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In some cases, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought greater awareness of the social component of sustainable development. However, as WBA's COVID-19 study highlights, in other cases, the pandemic has been used as a pretext to actually undermine human rights. And this is why we strongly welcome the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, which expresses the determination to build back better from the pandemic, with respect for human rights at the heart of recovery efforts. The pledge crucially acknowledges the interlinkage between human rights and other areas of sustainable development. In particular, the need to adopt climate and environment sensitive approaches to COVID-19 recovery efforts, including by aligning investments and domestic policies with the relevant objectives of the 2030 Agenda and with the Paris Agreement, and accelerating renewable energy transitions. If not managed well, then the low carbon energy transition could be prevented from happening at all through social unrest, and/or could result in both stranded assets and stranded workers and communities, which represent a systemic risk for companies and investors. If people are not actively involved in decision making and states do not implement their existing rights obligations, people will likely act to prevent the low carbon transition. So ultimately, the transition to a low carbon society will not be successful if commitments to implementing social standards are not prioritised alongside commitments to decarbonise. Hence, this week, WBA has released its Just Transition methodology. We will use this to assess high-emitting influential companies on their contributions to a decarbonisation and energy transformation that leaves no one behind. Underpinning such a just transition is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as outlined in the UNGPs. We've developed this methodology with input from around 150 stakeholders worldwide, and of course with guidance from our multi-stakeholder Just Transition Advisory Group, which includes representatives from other benchmarks like the Climate Action 100+, and investor-focused experts such as the Grantham Research Institute, who in their upcoming paper on translating just transition ambitions into investor action have explained how WBA's just transition methodology and findings will give a useful picture of where high-emitting sectors currently stand on just transition efforts, and over the coming years, how companies are progressing on this. This is one example of how the just transition methodology and assessments will act as a common framework for driving positive corporate action on an equitable decarbonisation transition and hold to account those that fail to do so. This can in turn enable investors to understand how to use their investments for a climate-sensitive COVID-19 recovery effort. It's our ambition that activating stakeholders in this way will create common and consistent approaches in driving action on just transition. We invite you all to use our assessments and to reach out to us to learn more about this work, to hold the world's most influential companies in high-emitting sectors to account, and to explore opportunities for collaboration, especially if you're interested in joining the WBA Alliance. And I believe my colleague will share a link to further information in the chat. Our methodology will be freely available for non-commercial use, and we've built it to apply to any sector or geography. So there really are opportunities for others to use this tool elsewhere to see how prepared companies are to really build back better for a just transition. Whether you're a part of a civil society organisation, a company, an investor, a government, or indeed an academic institution, everyone has a key role to play in ensuring a just and sustainable recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, also for sharing methodologies and tools, for the invitation. I think that's well appreciated by all of us. We have now reached the end of a very rich and very intense event. There have been so many brilliant points that really fit together to give pieces of the image that we see. There's so much to do. From the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we look forward to contributing to keeping this pledge on sustainable recovery with human rights at its heart, to keep it alive, to push for practical realization, along with Denmark, Fiji, Costa Rica, and the 43 other pledge countries that have signed so far, together with OSCHR, that is an important partner in this, UNDP and other UN agencies that also support the pledge, along with the major groups, civil society networks, organizations, partners, and allies. I have decided that I'm not going to try to wrap this up, but rather I want to give the final word to the rights holders around the world, who rightfully expect governments, decision makers, and all of us to live up to the SDG commitments and the human rights obligations that underpin the SDGs in the context of sustainable recovery. So in the last minute, I'm going to ask you to please join me in watching a 3-minute video that we will show now, where we will hear voices from around the world and take this opportunity to reflect on how you and your organization can contribute to sustainable recovery. I thank you all for your participation and contribution and look forward to the continued.
I sell groceries. Since when COVID-19 came, a lot of people were told to stay away from work. Now, even my business came down because no one was coming to buy. Let them make this vaccine available to us, the citizens, so that we can survive from this disease.
त्यही हो दुःख त अब कमाएर खानु सक्नु पनि छैन अब अहिले त झन् त्यो लप के भन्छ मलाई नाम पनि आउँदैन त्यो लपटमा के भन्दो रहेछ त्यो त मलाई आउँदैन नाम पनि त्यसले झन् धेरैजना मान्छेलाई उ भयो कहाँ पाउनु त खै अब कोरोनाले अब छिर्नु दिन सकेको छैन छिर्नु दिँदैन अब मैले भन्नु मन लाग्ने त्यही हो लाग्छ अब सरकारले भन अनि जनता त चाहिँदो रहेछ जनता त चाहिँदो रहेछ सरकारलाई अनि हामीले अब यसो यस्तो लकडाउन हुँदाखेरि यसो बारी पहिरो चल्दाखेरि यताउति हुँदाखेरि
Within weeks of the coronavirus pandemic, the country plunged into its worst press freedom crisis. More than 4,000 media workers lost their jobs, including journalists. In accusing us of being terrorists just because we are critical in our coverage, it was a direct and vicious attack on press freedom. But we persevere, encouraged by the historical fact that enemies of press freedom eventually get their comeuppance.
Esta hidroeléctrica que amenaza, como decíamos, en secar esos 4 kilómetros de río, que estas comunidades pues nos vemos beneficiadas con la pesca. El día que inició, ¿verdad? Entonces nos vimos en la necesidad de comenzar a movilizarnos para poder emitir nuestras opiniones, arriesgándonos, como decía, ¿verdad? Arriesgando nuestra salud, arriesgando nuestra vida y no solo la nuestra, sino con el riesgo de llevar el virus a nuestras familias, porque tuvimos que acudir a las autoridades competentes